sign-in sheets for this presentation. So if you signed in on the previous ones from the panel, just make sure to stop by on your way out after the presentation is over and sign in on the separate sign-in sheet so we can keep the two presentations separate from each other. So, thanks guys.
Well, it's my pleasure today to have Mr. Lynn Turner come and speak to you about how the accounting profession ended up being regulated. Lynn has an interesting background. He's been a partner with Coopers & Lybrand. You probably know PricewaterhouseCoopers out of the Denver office. He's been a CFO of a publicly held company. Then he became the chief accountant at the Securities and Exchange Commission. He has a degree from CSU
and Nebraska.
And Nebraska. I wasn't going to say that Nebraska, but he has a degree from Nebraska. He's from Nebraska. Came out here and has his master's from CSU. He's been involved with the accounting profession for many years. He tries to keep us doing the right things, and that's what we really appreciate about him. So, Lynn, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ryan. Ron has asked me to talk about how we, as a profession, became regulated, why we are where we are today. It's really actually a very simple answer. And after I give you the simple answer, we'll talk about what led up to that simple answer. Anyone got an idea as to why we're regulated by the PCAOB or the SEC today? Anyone venture? Any brave souls in here want to venture a guess? Shoot away.
Corruption.
Yeah, it doesn't exist just in Russia and China. Okay, that's for sure. Okay, any other venture guess? Enron? Okay.
Sarbanes-Oxley?
SOX. SOX is what created the regulation as we know it today. That's certainly true. Other brave souls? Let me tell you why we are regulated. It's very simple. We put out a lousy, corrosive, destructive product. Congress mandated that people had to use our product. And then we developed, put out a product that not only did it not work, but it turned out to be very destructive for the American good and for the American public. And that product cost the American public trillions of dollars of wealth at the time during a several year period when we had Enron, corruption in quite a large number of public companies, even some private, and as a result, the self-regulation was then created in SOX. But anytime you put out a lousy product as a business person, you're going to pay a severe price for it. Doesn't matter whether it is GM and Ford putting out the lousy product they did during the latter part of the 90s and the last decade, and then had to go into bankruptcy because people wouldn't buy their cars. Or whether you are a pharmaceutical company that puts out drugs that end up killing people, you're going to have a problem with that product and it's not going to work for you, and you as a business are going to fail, aka what happened with Anderson. Anderson wasn't brought down by the government. Anderson was brought down because they put out a very destructive, wasn't even a lousy product, it was a terrible product. And so when that happens, and you have that type of impact on the greater good in this country, it's up to the government, and the government should step in those situations and regulate. That's one of the reasons we have a government, is to regulate when people are out doing a tremendous amount of damage to the greater good of the public, and that's exactly what the profession did, costing people trillions, cost them money out of the retirement funds. There are 500,000 people invested in the Colorado State Pension Plan called COPERA. It has about $40 billion in assets these days. That thing was fully funded. In fact, it was 102% funded before we had the scandals at Enron. Today, that thing only sits at about 60% funded. That destructive of wealth started, and a good part of it came about correctly as a result of what transpired during this time period. In fact, the fund had money in Enron, WorldCom, and other companies that they all lost money on. And they lost money on because they invested in them, thinking that the numbers were right, the companies were worth what the market was pricing them on. And everyone turned out to find that those numbers were bad. And not only were they bad, the auditors knew they were bad at the time. They were telling the entire public that they were good. So in a nutshell, when you put out a product like that does destructive damage to the American public like it did, then you're going to get self-regulation. That's the simple version of it, okay? So how many of you going into accounting and auditing? Okay, all righty.
Don't scare them.
We'll see how it does going forward. How it does going forward probably depends a lot on what people do after they come out of college, like those of you in the room that are going to go into the accounting firms, and whether you do a good job and put out a good product or you don't. If you all come out and follow in the general footsteps of the people who have been in the profession before, you're probably likely going to find that we have similar type problems. And we'll see, though, if the profession can change the direction that it's been in. And that's highly questionable at this point in time to talk about that. But anyway, so the profession really started headed down the regulation mode. You know, it got started in the late 1800s. I think the first CPA license was granted around mid-1890s in the state of New York. By 1917, after we'd had the panic of 1907, and which the country got into deep trouble, it caused us to create the Federal Reserve Bank. They had to develop accounting standards for the banks so that they couldn't cook the books like they'd done before. And in 1917, they went to the profession, and for the first time we had come out of the profession accounting standards that were published under the name of the Federal Reserve, but they were really developed by the profession. And then we went through the roaring 1920s, which were in some regards a lot like our 1990s, a phenomenal, great economic time. But during that time, people got carried away with greed, with high degrees of corruption. Wall Street came up with bucket shops, offerings in which they really sold worthless stock to a large number of Americans. But even at that point in time, though, the entire market was only 1.5 million people. So there were about 1.5 million people invested in the stock market at the time of the stock crash, which started in 1929. Everyone thinks 1929 is the year when it took this big drop. It actually took the big drop not at one point in time, but over 1929 to 1932, when it really got down to a bottom. In fact, I think if you went back to 1930, might have recovered a lot of what it lost in 1929, but it was a gradual, long-term slide. As a result of that, you got to keep in mind when the crash had occurred, we had just elected a new president, President Hoover, who the dam's named for, and he was very anti-regulation. He was very pro-prohibition. And he just got elected, and as the market cratered and the economy went south, he believed in cutting back on the budget and very austere economic measures, and it directly contributed to a very severe depression. So by 1932, with 25% of the American public without a job, we talk about what we got a problem with now. It's a tremendous, terrible thing what we got now, especially for new kids coming out of school and looking for a job, laden with a lot of student loan debt. We actually have more student loan debt in this country than we do credit card debt. It's amazing what we've done. But at any rate, that had created such consternation in the country that when FDR ran for president in 32, he won overwhelmingly. It was throw out the vote, bring in a new guy. Roosevelt brings in a whole new team. He brings in a brilliant team of people. And one of the people that they bring in is a brilliant guy by the name of Ferdinand Cora. And Cora had been a prosecutor for the city of New York. And the Senate Banking Committee brought him in to do an investigation of what really had transpired in the market. So he brought into public hearings and questioned under oath, literally depositions in front of the public, all the giants on Wall Street, the head of what is now Citibank, the head of the New York Stock Exchange, the head of J.P. Morgan, all the major financial institutions, brought all their tax records out and showed how these people are really engaged in corruption and greed and done great damage to the American public. And that gave impetus to Congress then to first pass a law in 1933 that required companies to register with a regulator at that point in time as the Federal Trade Commission. And then the following year, after the hearings went on, they decided to create a new securities regulator called the Securities and Exchange Commission, which they created in the 1934 law. And those laws also required, for the first time, that there be audits, the examination of the books of these companies, so they could no longer cook the books like they had before, supposedly. And there was a question of, do we use the government regulators, do we use government auditors to do that, or do we do the private auditing firms, let them do it? The legislation was originally drafted to have the audits done by government auditors, which is the way we do examination of banks today. And as you can see, neither system has worked out worth a damn. So, you need to flip a quarter. So at any rate, they did decide to let the auditing profession do it. And so we've got this system set up whereby the public companies, which are, a lot of large companies where the greatest wealth is concentrated in the stock market, clearly. This is audited by these private independent auditors. But they also turned around and gave the SEC the right to certainly oversee the accounting standards and to require an independent audit. There had been some debate as to just how much oversight they actually had over the auditing profession, but that's the way the law got left. We went throughout the 30s. At about 1940, towards the end of 39, 1940, though, there was a big blow-up. Probably the first big corporate scandal after stock market crash. It was with a company, pharmaceutical company called McKesson. They're still around. They're one of the 3 biggest pharmaceutical distributors in the world today. So they're still around. Very, very successful company. But at that point in time, they found out that they cooked the books. They weren't really doing as good as what they thought they were doing. And if you've taken the auditing classes often taught, what happened was they, in the warehouse where they had inventory, the boxes were all empty. And the auditors had never thought to go look inside the box and see if there was anything actually in a novel idea. You know? But the auditors weren't smart enough at the time, I guess, to figure out, you know, maybe we ought to open at least 1 or 2 of these boxes and see if there's something really inside of it. And turned into a big scandal. And so at that point in time, there was also a debate, or shortly before that, there was a debate on the commission. William O. Douglas, who later on became the well-known Supreme Court Justice, was the chairman of the SEC at the time. And he wanted to adopt rules that said the SEC would set the accounting standards and would set the auditing standards. But he couldn't get his commissioners to go along with him. And by a 3-2 vote, he was overrode. And it was decided that the accounting firms and the profession would still set the accounting standards and would set the auditing standards. And then right after McKesson blew up, I suppose if McKesson had blown up just before that vote, there would have been a different vote. But it didn't happen. So then they decided to let the auditors do it. After McKesson, they pressed the auditors to turn around and write better auditing standards. And novel idea actually wrote the first standard to say you really got to look inside the box if you're counting inventory and see if it actually exists. And so that was really the first set of where we started to see auditing standards come out, self-regulation, if you will. The novel of we'll let the auditors self-regulate themselves, set their own rules and all, see how this works. And so they did that. We went on throughout the rest of the 40s. Most of the 40s was consumed with World War II. So there wasn't a whole lot of focus on the accounting profession. In fact, the whole country was consumed and focused on getting through World War II and whatever it took to do that. Then we rolled into the 50s. Eisenhower came in as the new president after Truman. Eisenhower was very deregulatory in mindset as well. In fact, he transferred the SEC. They ended up in Philadelphia, I think, at the time. We put a terrible commission together. And so throughout the 1950s, the commission did very little oversight of anything. It's actually considered the worst time period ever in the history of the SEC, and didn't do much. And so then we came to the 1960s. John F. Kennedy gets elected, and he appoints a new chairman of the SEC by the name of William Carey, well-known securities attorney, law professor, etc. And Carey starts looking at the regulation of the profession, and he also has as one of his commissioners a guy by the name of Manny Cohen, a very talented securities attorney as well. And that becomes important because Cohen comes back into the picture a while later. So we went throughout the 60s, so again the accounting profession was setting standards, but they weren't good standards and they weren't getting the job done. And during the latter part of the 60s, we had another bull market. We had an unbelievable amount of acquisitions going on, conglomerations being created, like International Telephone and Telegraph at the time was created. A lot of big conglomerates, and they were buying up a lot of companies, and the accounting that they were using for those transactions was pretty funky, not very accurate, not very good, kind of actually misleading. And as we got down to the end of the 60s, and the economy started to strain to keep going because we were pulling out of Vietnam in '72, we had this huge defense industry in the country. It had really been driving the country since World War II. it was going to have to downsize. The economy started to cool off. The market started to cool off. And all of a sudden, as is typical case, when the economy cools, the market cools, and then all of a sudden, companies who have been cooking the books can no longer cover up the fraud. And all of a sudden, we started to have a rash of bad situations where companies had to cook the books. First one that came out was one called Penn Central. Penn Central was the largest railroad company in the country at that point in time. A lot of people still rode the railroad at that point in time. In fact, it was very important to the industry up and down the East Coast. And Penn Central had to file bankruptcy. It had been audited by what was then known as Pete, Marwick, and Mitchell. And their books were totally cooked. They had terrible people on the board of directors who had done nothing, and it became the largest bankruptcy in the history of the country. I think it may still be the third largest behind Lehman Brothers, which is now the largest, and Enron's the second largest. I think Penn Central is still the third largest bankruptcy to date, certainly still in the top three, even though it happened over 4 decades ago. We had another large insurance company go under equity funding. We had troubles with those student loans again, national student marketing. There was actually a whole host of companies, just like in the corporate scandals about a decade ago, that failed and cost the people a lot of wealth. The market totally crashed. The IPOs totally disappeared, and there were no initial public offerings going on. There was also no SOX, not much regulation or anything that you could attribute it to, but it was just the economy went bad and people quit investing in the market when they couldn't trust it anymore. I mean, why would you put your money into a market that was, in essence, the equivalent of a Vegas casino? You have to be an idiot to do that, and people quit doing it. So that caused problems. And so as that started to happen, people started to ask the question, you know, where were the auditors? Why didn't you guys catch any of this? Were you actually opening the boxes up this time and looking inside? You know, where'd you miss it? And it became very clear that, again, the auditors were totally asleep at the wheel. So Congress started to hold some hearings and even started to find some worse things. At this point in time, we found out that there were a lot of bribes going on, that literally hundreds of corporations were bribing our government officials and executives to get contracts, profitable contracts, not only in the U.S. Heck, we were bribing everyone around the globe to take our money. And so we had a very bad situation with our businesses, their ethical standards or lack thereof, and that created some consternation about how was it that the auditors saw or didn't see this and make sure it was properly reflected in the books. And in fact, at that point in time, one of the highest people in the profession, a person who was vice president of the AICPA at the time, been in one of the firms, Maurice Stans, was found to have been involved with the Watergate scandal. And in fact, he got convicted of being involved with the Watergate scandal. So it was not a good time for the profession. Members of Congress in both the House and the Senate, as the Watergate hearings were going on, they started to hold hearings on these auditors and accountants again, once again asking, how could this have ever happened? They issued a very significant report called the MEPP report that was an independent investigation by Congress of the auditing profession and the accounting profession. It was very ugly. It detailed out some bad practices at the firms. Even the FASB, who had just been created, was highly criticized. They put a new person on the FASB who was supposed to be independent of his former firm, got all ties, got under Walter Schutz. Walter had been a partner of Mark and Mitchell, and left that to join the FASB. Just 2 years or so thereafter, left to go right back into work for his firm. So it started to create this revolving door type notion, like we have in Congress today, and that was bad news. So the profession was very criticized, and so the SEC set up a new commission that was headed by that former commissioner of the SEC, who would later become chairman, Manny Cohen. And the Cohen Commission started to look at the profession as well, and found there was a real disconnect between the product that investors were receiving, or the public was receiving, and what the profession was willing to give. And came out with a report about 78. At the same time, there were then discussions going on. Congress introduced a bill called, I think it was the Public Auditing Oversight Board at the time, actually Public Accounting Oversight Board at the time, and started to move legislation through that would have created a government-based regulator at that point in time. But the profession came back and said, no, don't do this to us. This is government overreach, bad stuff. You know, when bad stuff comes out of DC. And so let us create our own oversight board. We'll go find 5 well-known, well-established people in the profession, get them to put together this board, and we'll have them oversee what we do. In addition, we'll agree to do our own internal inspections, and we'll also agree to allow other firms to come in and inspect our work to see that we're doing a good job. And as a result, the Public Oversight Board, the private sector board, was created back around 1977 in a negotiation with Congress, the SEC, and the AICPA. And what it set up was a mechanism in which they would oversee inspections of one firm by another firm, under the notion that they'd really do rigorous inspections and see that one another firm was doing a good job. And in fact, you'd have, you know, a fresh set of eyes looking over one another's shoulder to ensure that the job being done was a good job. And so we had a step up, if you will, at the time in the form of self-regulation. It was still self-regulation, not the government, though. And that probably got off to a fairly good start in the first few years, established in 77. But as Reagan came into office in 81, things started to reverse back. Reagan was again very anti-regulation, anti-regulatory. Although nothing like what Hoover or Bush was. Reagan was more of a, while everyone thinks of him as a conservative Republican, in reality, he was more of a guy that tried to meet people in the middle. And so, at any rate, though, when he comes in, he gets the new chairman at the SEC, and this guy is anti-regulatory. It's a guy named John Shadd, who worked at, I think it was Dillon Reed on Wall Street, one of the big investment banking firms at that point in time. And Shadd was just flat out not a regulator, to say the least. He did go very hard and diligently after insider trading, but insider trading was just not where most investors lose money. That may be fine to deal with and should be dealt with in the marketplace, but it's not where you really protect people's money, because the money is really lost for the most part in just major accounting financial fraud type cases. But as a result of that, the firm started to go soft with regulation. They got a new guy in, I think it was a former Sears CEO, running the PLB for a while, and it kind of just started to flop. And what really developed was these firms, when they go audit one another, it became a culture of, if you don't tell on me, I won't tell on you, and we're both going to look pretty good. So as they do these inspections and issue the reports to the public, they started to come out, they were always fine. In fact, on the major accounting firms, they started out at 8 and went down to 6 and then 5, pushed down to 4 now. In the entire time period that this process was in place, not once was there ever a negative report on an audit of one of those big firms. In fact, the final report issued was the final report on Anderson. In the years that they'd done the audits of Enron, WorldCom, Quest here in town, audits that are well known to have been total flops. And a number of those had come to light before the POB had issued the final report on Anderson. In fact, they demanded that the inspectors of Anderson, which was the audit firm at Deloitte & Touche, go visit the audits done in the Houston office where Enron was hired. Go take a look at those audits. Let's see if we have a problem. Deloitte came back and said, the audits are all fine, there's no problem. What people didn't realize, though, was in that process, the firms had agreed with one another, with the acquiescence of these 5 people running and overseeing this whole thing, that never would any audit that was having the trouble and being litigated would ever be inspected. So the audits where there were really problems were never examined and never inspected, which is why we constantly had the good reports. But this is what the firms wanted. The firms wanted to create a situation where they would never be tainted, regardless of how good a product it was or how bad a product it was that they were putting out. It was extremely flawed. Having been an executive at a manufacturing company, it's equivalent as if I turned around and said, listen, if we have a lot of product parts that we're producing that are bad, let's just go ahead and ship them out. We'll just never tell anyone that they're bad, even if we know they're bad. It's ridiculous, because eventually it will always come to light that something blows up and doesn't work. And then it looks like we're covering it up, which is exactly what they're doing. Anyone in their right mind could have figured this out. Anyone of you in this room could have sat back and looked at this and said, whoa, you know, this just doesn't make sense. But it was designed not to make sense, but designed to ensure that the problems that actually existed were never examined, were never reported on, and as a result, were never dealt with. I've learned in business, having been involved with running 3 of these things now, that you're only successful with respect to what you actually measure, because it's only what you measure that you actually can manage. And then all too often, our executives, when they have a problem, don't measure, and therefore they cannot manage. And the companies are a flop. And quite often, that's because they don't put in the controls and the systems that they need to manage those type of things. I got a good friend that is now the corporate controller at General Motors. He was brought in to General Motors a few years ago to assist with the turnaround, getting to where they can figure out what was going on in the company and actually start to turn that thing around from being a total flop and a loser to actually turning out good product so they could sell it and actually make money again. Nick told me that when he came into GM, the first thing he did was he went around to each of his direct reports worldwide within GM and started to ask them to certify to him that their systems were good enough and certify to him that their numbers were accurate. There was not a single one of his direct reports in GM at the time that was willing to do that. Not a single one. GM had no internal controls. GM couldn't tell you if they were making money or losing money. which is why that company ended up in bankruptcy, and why the American taxpayer, by myself and others that pay taxes, had to bail those idiots out. And quite frankly, when we had to bail them out, we should have taken everyone in the executive office and everyone on the corporate board at the time and thrown them in the Potomac River without a vote. I don't know that I'd even throw them a paddle or a life raft, you know, and I'd throw a few bank people in with that list. But it's ridiculous that people were able to run a company that poorly, get paid tens of millions for it, take the money away from investors, and have that type of outcome. That was outrageous. But anyway, so as we had the corporate scandals, and by the way, when I was at the commission, we'd seen many of these problems. I went back to the commission in '98. I'd been there once before, from '89 to '91, watching some of this developed and overseeing some of these standard-setting activities. When I went back in '98, I knew the system was bad. I'd been a CFO as I left and went back to the commission. And spent a lot of time talking to my compatriots, other CFOs, types, all around the country, and understood that the auditors were just turning a blind eye to some very, very bad accounting. In fact, I'd even seen it within my own firm when we had accepted some horrendous accounting at Quest. We had actually had a big fight within my own firm in which people at the top thought that the accounting done by Quest was absolutely outrageous, not GAAP. And yet Quest and Bell Atlantic at the time, Verizon, probably Pactel at the time now on the West Coast, we audited many of these telecom companies, and they were all S&P 50 size companies. They were all in the top 50 largest companies, so they were all automatically the largest fees, some of the largest fees we got. And the firm was afraid that if we told Quest no, that we would turn around and get fired by Quest. And so the firm agreed to accept it. And then went and argued with the SEC at the time about why the accounting should be accepted, even though internally we had emails and memos from people at the top of the firm saying how bad it was. And in fact, two partners who served on the board of partners at the time of the firm were personally told that if they ever allowed something like that to happen again, they'd be fired. Yet we still issued reports to the public saying those financial statements of Quest were A-OK and not a problem. Never mentioned any concern to the public about it whatsoever. And that's one of the things that really gets under the skin of people investing in the market, is when you as an auditor know there's a big problem, we're in essence paying your bill, and you sit there and don't say anything to us about the problem. At that point in time, we want the shirt off your back, your firstborn, your house, and probably your wheels. And that's kind of where we've gotten to today. So we got to the scandals. It blew up. It became very evident that a number of these audits, and it involved all the firms, Enron people know, WorldCom people know. But at Xerox, when I was chief accountant, in February of 2001, we brought KPMG and Xerox into the commission and told them that there were problems with the Xerox financial statements. What KPMG and Xerox didn't know was the day before that meeting, we'd met with Senior Executive VP of Marketing at Xerox, who provided us documents and internal emails between the CEO and CFO highlighting the fraud that was going on. We gave that information the following day to Xerox and KPMG. It was about the middle of February of 2001. Yet, KPMG, the first week of June of that year, would sign off on those financial statements without making any changes whatsoever. What was even worse about it was about a year before, the KPMG partner on Xerox had disagreed with the company about the accounting that was being used, and expressed that view to Xerox. The executives at Xerox then turned around and called the CEO of KPMG at the time, Steve Butler, and told Butler if he wanted to keep the audit, they were going to have to keep the partner. So Butler turned around and changed the partner, brought in as the new partner the vice chairman of the firm, a guy by the name of Mike Conway, who was already under investigation at the SEC for another fraud involving outright violation of auditor independence that did end up being an SEC sanction called the Baymarker International case. He puts Conway on the audit at Xerox, tells the former partner, hey, we'll keep you in the firm if you like. We've got a job for you in Finland. If you don't want to take the job in Finland, then you'll have to leave the firm. You know, so it's not as bad as getting banished to the Iceland or Russia. But you know, for an auditor, Finland probably isn't much farther off. So, and Conway comes in. Conway's in that meeting with us in February of '01. And Conway's also the partner again that signs off on those financial statements after having been told by the SEC that they're just flat out wrong and there's fraud going on. No adjustments, no mention in the report, no mention in the disclosures about the fraud. And then KPMG wonders why at the end of the day they have to pay out millions in cases like that, hundreds of millions, to settle. But they knew about the problem. There could be no question because the SEC had actually given them, you know, here's a situation where not only are you told there's a fraud, but the SEC, the COP, actually gives you the evidence of it, hands it to you, and you still don't do anything with it. You know? You sit there and you go, oh my God, you know? And then you wonder what transpires. At Adelphia, audited by Deloitte and Touche, Deloitte had actually known that there was debt that Adelphia owed money on, was co-guarantees on, was co-signers on, that wasn't on their books, was on the books of a separate entity owned by the same Regas family that was never reported to the investors of Adelphia, even though that company would have to pay the debt, even though the Regases never had the ability to pay themselves that debt or their other company, it would have to come from Adelphia. In fact, they went to the management of Adelphia and said, you need to disclose this. And Adelphia said, we won't disclose it. And Deloitte still turned around, knowing all of that, went out and told the public the financial statements were fine. Not unlike what they did on Parmalat, in their audit of Parmalat, which is an amazing situation. Here's a company, a big international company, been audited by Grant Thornton. And Italy has an auditor rotation requirement. You have to rotate auditors every periodic years, 9 years, I forget exactly, I think it might be 9 years or whatever. So they were coming up for a mandated rotation. And in the Caribbean, Grant Thornton had counseled, advised, consulted with the management of Parmalat to set up this offshore Caribbean business entity, shell corporation, that they could run cash from. The auditors had consulted and advised the company to create this thing down in the Caribbean. And they were laundering money through it. So when the rotation came up, they went out for RFP, Parmalat did, and they went to all the major firms. And they told all the firms, we want to consider you as our auditors, but there's one thing you have to agree to, and that is to allow us to keep Grant Thornton as the auditors for this very small thing down in the Caribbean. That's the only thing, you know. Other than that, you can do it all. PricewaterhouseCoopers, to their great credit, turns around and tells Parmalat, no dice, all or nothing. Parmalat says, nope, you're out. Deloitte gets the audit. Grant Thornton gets to continue to audit the Caribbean sub where the fraud is. But there are problems with the financials. And the Brazilian Deloitte & Touche affiliate turns around and says, something smells fishy here. Says, we don't like it, and we think we ought to say something about our concerns on some related party transactions, as I recall. In our report, this should not be a clean report unless they agree to make some additional disclosures, which Parmalat says no, they won't do. The Italian firm actually signing the audit opinion in this firm on this financial statements says if we ask Parmalat to do that, they'll fire us. We can't do that. So the issue gets taken to the international CEO of the firm, a guy by the name of James Copeland, in the national office of DT in New York. Copeland looks at it and he says, I tell you what I'll do. We'll take a look at it, consider it, but whatever our general counsel decides to do, Rich Murray, that'll be the final judge on this. So the Brazilian Italian firms take the issue to the general counsel and he looks at it. And at the end of the day, the general counsel rules in favor of the Italian firm and says, we're not going to require them to disclose it. The report goes out, and of course it turns into fraud, blows up, and Deloitte & Touche in the U.S. says, well, that's an Italian company. You shouldn't be able to sue us for this. If you want to sue someone, go and sue the Italian firm. Even though the final decision on this very critical issue was made in the U.S. by the head of the U.S. and his general counsel, resident here in the U.S. It was U.S. people and citizens that caused the damage. And so they took this to court. And the judge came back and ruled and said, sue on. He said, this is outrageous, what you guys did. And in light of the involvement of the people at the very top of the firm here in the U.S., you can sue them and you can hold them accountable, and that lawsuit is ongoing today. But as a result of things like at Parmalat, at Xerox, and at Enron, it was decided, there was tremendous public outrage, really spurred on mostly by WorldCom then in the end, that this was so lousy and so destructive that there was no way we could allow this destruction to continue to occur in this country, in this lousy product. And so as a result, they created this new 5-person board that's underneath, it's really a subset of the SEC. It has 3 CPAs on it, or at least former auditors on it, 3 who are not. And so they currently oversee the process. And that's why we've moved from being a self-regulated thing to put out such a lousy product to being a regulated one. Whether or not it turns out to be a better product or not, we'll see. There's a lot of consternation right now that the product still isn't that good, that the auditors still aren't coming to light with problems that they have. So the PCLB currently has projects on its agenda where it's considering requiring the auditors to tell you about those problems when they know them. That's going to change to what's in the standard auditor report, to one that would tell us if you know there's problems. because it seems like the PCOB continues to see problems with the independence of auditors, they're now proposing auditor rotation, which would probably help. I think it would help. It won't solve the problem, though. I think that problem will only be solved when we turn around and change who pays the auditors. I personally think we need to have the PCAOB oversee a fund from the public companies. We'd have them collect fees, probably as a percentage of revenue, drop into that. And then the auditors would be paid out of that. And there'd be a negotiation between the auditors and the audit committee, and not the CFOs. Today, even though the audit committees are supposed to be hiring and firing the auditors, in reality, that just isn't occurring. It's still the CFOs and controllers negotiating all that, and audit committees are workless, and signing off, rubber stamping just what they get from the CFOs. So you have to strengthen that and have this negotiation. Until we get to this mechanism, we won't solve the problem. And as evidence of the problem, we recently had the PCLB come out with a landmark case against Ernst & Young called Medicine. And if you read the release on Medicine, it notes that this audit of this pharmaceutical company was inspected by Ernst & Young's own inspection team. They call it their National Quality Review team. They came in and inspected the audit of Medicis and found that the accounting was wrong and didn't comply with GAAP. And one of the partners challenged the audit report and challenged the accounting. And there were emails and memos all laid out in black and white that highlighted this and these findings. Notwithstanding that, E&Y's engagement team then said, okay, well, if the reason we're using this accounting had to deal with revenue and sales returns, and there is accounting pronouncement on sales returns, correctly on point, it's not like you have to do it by analogy. It's called accounting for sales returns, so it's pretty straight. But Ernst & Young decided, well, if their accounting didn't comply with this standard, then they go try to justify it on something else. And so they went and said, we'll use warranty accounting for our sales returns. Well, warranty accounting is for something totally different. It's a totally different standard. And they said, we'll try to justify it using this and still accept their financials in the audit report. And, oh, by the way, they never told the company, they never told the audit committee, this is all highlighted in the release, never told the audit committee, and never told the management team at the company about this. And it was only when the PCLB's own inspectors came in the following year and started to look at this and question it, and then started an investigation to start to find all the emails, the internal documents at E&Y that found this problem, that it came to light. And this involved some of the top partners at Ernst & Young. It included two of their national office partners, one by the name of Mark Siebert, who had actually been on a fellowship at the FASB, had been in their national office, was one of their top national consulting partners. A guy by the name of Bob Tebow, their top national partner on the West Coast out of LA, overseeing all their accounting, auditing type issues and consultation on the West Coast. Both of those guys were involved and had signed off and blessed on this, as well as the audit partner and the manager and the engagement team. And so here in the last, I think it was just in February, the PCOB came out and announced an enforcement action against these people, including the two national office guys. Those are the third and fourth national office partners of Bernstein Young to be sanctioned in recent years. 2 of which had spent time on fellowships at the FASB, so they certainly knew exactly what they were doing. The problem is that the audit firms are finding the problems just they found here, but they never tell us in the public about it. So why would I ever want to pay an auditor for that? There's no reason for me to pay. And in fact, yesterday I was back testifying to the Senate Banking Committee, and one of the senators, Senator Warner from Virginia, who used to be a venture capitalist, made the comment to me during the hearing, well, Lynn, don't you think, he says, as I look at the internet and all the information being made public, don't you find that these problems are coming to light a lot quicker than what they used to? My response back to the senator was, certainly that is the case. We're finding them much sooner, so they aren't able to hopefully grow as big. But the problem is, even when the internet finds them, it's after the fact. And if I've invested my money in that company, I've already lost it. So rather than being found by the auditors at the beginning, we're having to find it after the fact on the internet. What's more important about his comment is I ran research in a financial proxy research firm called Glass Lewis. And we used tools that we bought out of Wall Street, that Wall Street uses, that hedge funds uses, that quant shops uses, modeling, data, databases. And you can overlay search engines, models, and access some of this information in filings. There's a phenomenal amount of information. You know, you'd be amazed at what you can find in filings done with the Secretary of State in a particular state. We found problems at Dell that later turned out to be a fraud doing that. Well, you can get this data today, and as a result of that data coming in, we are finding frauds much earlier. But you know what? It is never the auditors that find it. It is the independent research firms that find it. So it raises a question as to why should I pay for you all to go do audits that are doing me no good? Because I know when you find the problem, you aren't going to tell me about it. And as I explained to a group of academic accounting department chairs a couple of weeks ago in New Orleans, I think that if this trend continues, and I hope it won't, because I must say during my days in the profession, I thoroughly enjoyed it, had a great time, it was a great educational experience. But if this trend continues for another couple of decades, I would propose that 2 decades down the road, we will not need auditing firms. Because in fact, the internet and the digital access to all the public data will give me better information to invest on than I will ever get out of the audited financial statements. And when we invest, I currently serve as a trustee, I think I mentioned at the beginning, of this $40 billion fund. When we invest, we're investing for 500,000 people. We invest to get them the highest possible return. That's our goal. And we don't care whether we invest in the U.S. or we invest internationally. We're looking for the highest possible return because we've got to earn enough money so those people have money to retire on. That probably seems a long ways away for most of you in the room. And in the meantime, by the way, thank you for all paying for my Social Security. I appreciate it. You aren't ever going to see it. My condolences, but thank you at the same time. But at the end of the day, we have to earn as much money as possible for people to retire on. And when I look at this system, and I look at the lousy product, it's just not worth me paying for this anymore. I'm better off paying for independent financial research firms because the likelihood the certified fraud examiners have found that the likelihood that this product finds the problem is not very high. And it finds it late, and it finds it after the fact, except for when it finds it, and it doesn't tell me about it, which is even worse off. And that's what we're finding. On a big project, you find it, you don't tell me about it, so why should I pay you? And that's why we're where we're at with regulation. I suppose some people will push towards government auditors next go around. My push would be more to the financial independent research firms and just scratch the public accounting and auditing firm, public auditing firms who do some form of accounting, but we can give that to the SEC in totality in about the independent audits. If we don't change, we've probably got 2 decades in which to do that. So, with that, any questions? This is good stuff. We can stay here till midnight. Yeah.
I'm curious to know your opinion on who's more to blame, the government or greedy big companies for these financial crises and scandals. Because for me personally, I think it's more big government, or not big government, big companies. Because one of my old professors in my undergrad told me that capitalism is individual greed with ethics, and I think that these people got so greedy that they lost their ethics. And I honestly think that people could kind of regulate themselves if they had those ethical standards.
Yeah, no one forced people to go make these bad loans.
Yeah.
And the real heart of the problem, the government played a major role there, but you can't fault the government. Ultimately, you got to hold the people accountable who did it.
Yeah.
And the people who did it were the people who made the bad loans. I remember when my daughter was going to school here, and after her first year in those luxurious dorms, she wanted to move out. Can't fathom that, you know. And so we bought her a condo here in town. And as we went to buy the condo, we went to get a mortgage on it. And I had to fight with the local greedy people here on my loan because I told them I want a straight 30-year fixed loan. And they kept coming back, no, how about we do one of these all day, or how about if we do one of these adjustable loans? I don't want that. Just give me you know, what's wrong with the good old-fashioned 30-year fixed loan, and I'll put 10% down, you know? Seems to make sense to me. I literally had to fight with the people here at the local brokerage house in Greeley to get that. And finally, it was only when I said, if you won't give me a 30-year loan, I'm going to go someplace else. And then they said, okay, fine, we'll give it to you. So it was everyone from the local brokerage house here in Greeley to the people at the top of these banks who packaged this up and sold it off to the unsuspecting public. Ultimately, those were the people, all of those people who should have gone to jail. Unfortunately, they've taken a few of those people in that local house doing the loans and thrown them in jail. They haven't thrown anyone at the top in jail. When they actually sanctioned the CEO of Countrywide, it was not a criminal sanction. He got off criminally totally. It was a civil sanction in which he had to pay a fine, and the entire fine was paid for out of the insurance that the company had. He didn't pay a single dime. And yet the SEC goes around counting, oh, we got a $25 million settlement from Mozilla. They didn't get a dime from Mozilla. They got it from an insurance claim that ultimately I, as the shareholder, will have to pay. So from the perspective of who did it, those people need to go pay the price. And there needs to be some people accountable, and there needs to be some people go to jail. If you look at the court documents on Mozilla, he knew exactly what he was doing, and he got it scot-free. And that's true with a number of these people. I've got a good friend who was one of the directors on Merrill Lynch, as Merrill Lynch failed and had to be sold out to another failing institution, B of A, who also bought Countrywide. Why the feds ever let that happen is beyond me. People thought Greenspan was brilliant. I was in with Greenspan on many a meeting. I remember a meeting with Greenspan where we were talking about these financial reports, and Greenspan turns to me, and the chairman of the SEC and general counsel, all three of us were there in a meeting with him and our banking regulators, and Greenspan turns to me and says, hey, Lynn, what's wrong with the banks? Fudge the numbers a little bit. Well, I think we now know the answer to that question. You get these people in Washington who are put up on a pedestal that just don't deserve it. Greenspan was never that bright. Greenspan, you know, I grew up on a farm, and we had an expression for people like Greenspan. We called him dumb as a stump. You know, in all my dealings with him, this guy was not that brilliant, and he let us down. In fact, Greenspan was so stupid, he had one of his fellow board members, a guy by the name of Ned Gramley, who came out in a number of public speeches, said we were headed for a train wreck with the subprime loans. This is about 2004, 2005. Greenspan's reaction is he goes out and does some speeches critical of Gramley and downplaying the issue. And then two of the other major banking regulators at the OCC sue the state attorney generals who are trying to stop some of this lending, sue them, take them all the way to the Supreme Court, where they get a decision prohibiting the state attorney generals from bringing action against some of these banks for doing this type of lending. Now, I hear people talk about Russia and the problems with the government in Russia. I got to tell you, at times, the Russians don't have much on us. We have got serious problems. About a month ago, in New York, on Wall Street, at a major event honoring one of the best investors of our time, one of the most widely respected investors of our time, Jack Bogle, who started what is now quickly becoming the largest fund in the world, the Vanguard Fund. And Jack, in his remarks over the lunch hour, talked about something that other people had talked about during the day. Paul Volcker, Arthur Levitt, Alan Blinder, the former vice chairman of the Fed, when Greenspan was there, and they'd all been very critical of our government and its inability to do anything. And at lunch, Jack Bogle made the comment that he believed the U.S. has now lost its ability to govern itself. That is a phenomenal statement coming from such a senior and widely respected statesman in this country. That someone like that, who tends to be very well spoken, would turn around and say that absent some changes, we can no longer govern ourselves and get ourselves out of the problem that we've gotten into. That is phenomenal. That should be extremely scary for everyone in this room. So we'll see what happens. Should be fascinating. Like I said, thank you for my Social Security. Any other questions? Good stuff. All right, if not, thank you. Have a good day.